The Paleoartist's Handbook, Recreating Prehistoric Animals in Art, by Mark P Wittons. An Introduction to Paleoart. The ordinary public cannot learn much by merely gazing at skeletons set up in museums. One longs to cover their nakedness with flesh and skin, and to see them as they were when they walked this earth. Henry N. Hutchinson, 1910. Most people are aware that paleontologists, the scientists who study extinct life, sometimes work with artists to produce works of art featuring ancient species and landscapes. The details of this process are mostly murky in the public sphere, however, because rarely discussed outside of specialist venues and of seemingly little interest compared to finished illustrations, paintings, sculptures, or animations of fossil creatures. In fact, there is a whole discipline for this form of artistry, replete with its own specialist knowledge base, skill sets, recognized artists, and a long history, all dedicated to the reconstruction of extinct animals, plants, and their landscapes in illustration and sculpture. This discipline has been variably named over the last 2 centuries, but is best known today as Paleoart. Figure 1.1. The term Paleoart, sometimes spelled Paleoart, this reflects the American English spelling of paleontology instead of the English spelling of paleontology, and Paleoartist were created by celebrated paleoartists Mark Hallett in his 1987 article, The Scientific Approach of the Art of Bringing Dinosaurs Back to Life. The term is portmanteau of paleontological art, paleontology being the scientific study of extinct life and fossils. Somewhat confusingly, paleoart is also used in archaeological literature to refer to artistic creations of prehistoric people. An alternative term for this art form of reconstructing fossil animals is paleontography, which has been coined by another artist, John Conway, and might offer a solution to this confusion. Paleontography is used in some circles, although paleoart remains the dominant term by far, and will be used. Whilst the discipline of paleoart was only recently named, its history extends as far back as paleontological science itself. The first modern piece of paleoart, a sketched restoration of Pterodactylus antiquus, a Jurassic flying reptile, dates to 1800, and was produced for private correspondence between scholars. In the next half-century, paleoart entered scientific literature, was then used as an educational device for students, then to educate the public, and eventually as a basis for merchandising opportunities. Initially practiced by scholars themselves, natural history artists began to enter the employment of scientists to facilitate the production of grander and more technically accomplished artworks early in paleoart history. This relationship between scientists and artists continues today. We can thus essentially see the origins of our modern paleoart industry, a tool for scientific, educational, and commercial application dating back to the 1850s, over 160 years ago. In that time, paleoart has undergone several movements and renovations, shown a steady increase in popularity, and is now recognized as one of the most important assets in the popularization of paleontology and scientific outreach. The skills and knowledge required to practice paleoartistry takes a long time to attain. It requires a great amount of scientific knowledge to understand data presented by a fossil specimen, the environment it lived in, and how unpreserved anatomies, muscle and skin, can be rationalized from fossil data. Equally important are the skills of a natural history artist, such as being able to produce realistic scenes of the natural world, to arrange interesting compositions, and predict how light and shadow would play out on alien ancient forms. A growing body of books, websites, and exhibitions showcase paleoart, but the process behind these reconstructions remains largely confined to relatively obscure or specialist publication venues, often written in technical language that challenges lay audiences. This book attempts to outline this process in a detailed but understandable manner. This is not a how to draw dinosaurs guide, where prehistoric animals are broken down into geometric shapes for easy illustration. but a discourse on how artists and researchers can read fossil remains to obtain scientifically credible understanding of their life appearance and behavior, and translate these into attractive, informative artworks. We will cover the goals and limitations of paleoart, the history of the discipline, the methods employed to reconstruct the ancient tissues and life appearances of long-dead animals, look at the conventions and depicting these creatures in restored ancient landscapes, and finally, outline aspects of working in the paleoart industry today. Because producing an artwork is only part of the paleoart process. It is hoped that this content will be of interest to those who commission and advise on paleoart, consultants, exhibition designers, and other paleoart patrons have their own best practices too. Objectives and aims of paleoartistry. The drive to produce paleoart seems to act at a fairly primal subconscious level. Much like some of us feel a need to capture landscapes and fauna in natural history art. Looking at fossils makes some of us want to rationalize and predict the likely life appearance of these long-extinct creatures. The exact cause behind drives is probably unimportant. It may be enough to admit that nature is fascinating and beautiful, that we enjoy expressing our admiration of it in art. And that art helps us communicate our ideas and interpretations of the world with others. It is important, however, to discuss exactly what we can hope to achieve in paleoart, what its main applications are, and where its limitations lie. Defining a genre of art is never easy, but it's clear that not all artwork involving fossils can be considered paleoart works. We might broadly diagnose paleoart as requiring these three essential elements. 1. Being beholden to scientific data. 2. Involving a restorative component to fill in missing yet essential biological data. And of course, 3. Relating to extinct subject matter such as ancient landscapes, animals, and plants. We can thus rule out any technical illustrations of fossil specimens as paleoart, as they might depict components of fossil organisms, and they might be scientifically informed, but they lack a restorative element. A skeletal restoration or mounted skeleton of a fossil creature might be classed as paleoart, however, as they involve reconstructing damaged or missing bones, inferring posture, and sometimes predicting a soft tissue outline. They do not, of course, attempt to show living animals as we would see them in life, and some may argue that that prevents them being true paleoart. Whether they are classifiable as paleoart or not, they are clearly a related art form, and their production is an important step in the paleoartistic process. Paleoartistry is not science, but science-informed art. There is a large scientific component to paleoart production, but the overwhelmingly majority of fossil animals cannot be restored without extrapolation, prediction, and more often than we like to admit, some degree of speculation. It is important that we remain as evidence-led as possible, however, and one of the most critical goals of paleoart is accurately portraying elements of ancient subjects which we can be sure of. Aspects like animal size, their basic proportions, known or reliably inferred aspects of their soft tissue anatomy, their contemporary fauna, flora, and habitats, and so on. When data runs dry, we do not take the approach of anything goes. We must use reasoned extrapolation and informed speculation to plug the gaps necessary to bring our work to completion. The moment we start taking an anything goes attitude to recreating fossil life, it ceases to be paleoart and it becomes paleontologically inspired art. We should ask ourselves, what specifically are we restoring in paleoart? The actual truth of ancient worlds or hypotheses about the life appearance and paleobiology of our subject species? Generally speaking, paleoartistry is seen to pursue accurate renditions of ancient species, seeking one true visage of an ancient species. Our artwork is judged against its conformity to scientific thought and described as accurate or inaccurate, based on its adherence to contemporary paleontological hypotheses. But is accuracy what we're really after in paleoartistry? In reality, what is considered accurate is in a constant state of flux within paleontological science. As evidenced by paleoart works themselves, we have sometimes dramatically altered our perceptions of the appearances and lifestyles of ancient organisms. Moreover, science is not a linear process where a single concept always takes pole position as the most accurate interpretation of a given issue. Scientific progress is messy and non-linear, with our knowledge of a given topic branching, reversing, ceasing, and reviving and revising as it goes along. A united consensus on what is accurate will exist on some topics. While opinion may be divided over a few hypotheses on other subjects, or else a field may be poorly understood and open to many interpretations, the idea that paleoart can always reflect a single truly accurate idea is very naive to the scientific process, and implies that our reconstructions can be thoroughly tested against fossil data. This is also false, because so much of the data required to comprehensively reconstruct fossil subjects are now lost to time. Paleoartistry may thus be better described as the process of illustrating credible contemporary interpretations of prehistoric animals, where testable aspects accord with fossil data and non-testable aspects are based on well-researched inference. Our primary goal and guiding thought should be the creation of defensible and likely interpretations of ancient life, and we should not pretend that we are able to portray definitive versions of fossil animals. Because our data are always improving, science is always shifting the goalposts of what is probable, and most of our artworks will be superseded in time. Our work records the history of paleontological thinking, synthesizing opinions on the anatomy, lifestyles, and habitat preferences of ancient animals that were contemporary to our generation of paleontological science. But paleoartists are not beholden to scientists for improving our understanding of ancient life. Through careful study of fossils and anatomy, artists also move us closer to depicting genuine realities of ancient life, as has been demonstrated by several researching paleoartists in the last 2 centuries. This view is not meant to be pessimistic or disparaging. However, our ability to interpret life appearance is always improving, and our increasingly science-led approach to paleoart means we are following the right paths to ever more credible restorations. Even if there is still some way to go, if we need encouragement, the history of paleoart is a fantastic record of how far we have already come. Applications of paleoart. Paleoart works feature in a variety of scientific and popular outlets. In what we might consider its oldest and most traditional application, paleoart appears in scientific literature to illustrate the mechanics of a hypothesis or summarize the results of a research paper. Skeletal reconstructions and restorations of new species are especially common. Paleoart works in scientific literature. Such arrangements have fostered a long-held mutualistic relationship between scientists and paleoartists, with ideas crossing each way between these parties. The process of producing paleoart can be informative to science, and a number of artists have made observations on the anatomy of fossil organisms that are relevant to understanding their paleobiology. This shouldn't be surprising. Paleoartists must understand anatomy to do their jobs well, and they may be the first individuals to reconstruct the proportions of fossil organisms in detail. They can thus sometimes make determinations about the extent of musculature or morphology of ancient creatures, which have otherwise gone unnoticed to their partner scientists, especially if those scientists have expertise in areas unrelated to anatomy. Moreover, understanding the masses and centers of balance in ancient animals is reliant on some degree of soft tissue restoration, and paleoartists are often very skilled at this. A number of individuals, such as Mark Anton, Gregory S. Paul, and Robert Backer, my boy Robert, have had made contributions to scientific literature thanks to the application of paleoartistic methodologies. Paleoart is widely used as a tool for scientific outreach and public education, as a visually arresting medium which communicates paleobiological hypotheses across language barriers and educational levels. Few sciences can boast such a powerful means to convey research findings. Paleontologists and educators capitalize on its potential fully. Permanent and temporary museum exhibits, including rare paleoart galleries, showcase paleoart prominently, and virtually all paleontological public relations exercises feature paleoart somewhere. The success of outreach of campaigns is often correlated with the strength of its artwork, and these provide obvious hooks through which media outlets can grab attention and convey the outreach story. The impact of outreach related paleoart is often detectable long after the initial press interest is over, as those artworks become inspiration and reference points for later works. Impact of another kind. Scientific recruitment is also traceable to paleoart. Many paleontologists can follow their interests in fossil life back to attention-grasping paleoart work seen in their youth. A final application of paleoart is to paleontology-themed products, toys, books, educational software, video games, documentary programs, and blockbuster movies. These are perhaps more paleoart reliant than they are indebted to fossil specimens or scientific studies, because they make use of fully restored fossil animals and not their fossil remains or reconstructed skeletons. This mass media paleoart probably accounts for the majority of paleoart produced today, although most of these products have little or no involvement from individuals that we might consider genuine paleoartists, as well as a very relaxed or even non-existent attitude to scientific credibility. Paleoart as a basis for merchandise. The idea of merchandising prehistoric animals is nothing new, having been around since at least the 1830s and 1850s. But the modern age has taken the manufacture and marketing of paleontology-themed products to an unprecedented level. Most of the artwork produced for this purpose, from the creature designs for films, TV shows, and games, to the illustrations of popular books, is not executed by paleoartists or with detailed constellation of scientific literature. Rather, the prioritizing of speed and economy in merchandise production leaves little time for careful research or a stepwise reconstruction process that characterizes true paleoartistry. Under these conditions, it is easier and quicker to reference existing paleoart than it is easier to create original work. This practice sees many fossil organisms become stereotyped in their portrayal, and leads to erroneous and outdated ideas remaining prevalent in popular culture for years or decades after science has moved on. The appearance of prehistoric animals might be embellished for many products to enhance their tonal suitability or boost audience appeal. These facts mean that the majority of paleontologically themed merchandise only loosely meets one of our criteria for paleoartistry, being beholden to scientific data, and we might not consider such works true paleoart. Rather, they are derivative of science-based paleoart works, molding existing reconstructions to suit the budget, audience demands, and popular appeal of the associated product. Nowhere are the liberties with prehistoric animal depictions made more obvious than in Hollywood films. For many, these have produced the definitive versions of prehistoric animals. But even seemingly credible examples, like the stop-motion creations of Ray Harryhausen or the Jurassic Park dinosaurs designed by Stan Winston Studios, were ultimately beholden to aesthetic decisions or technical limitations rather than scientific evidence. Harryhausen has made no secret that many of his prehistoric animals were enhanced in one way or another, and that many were hybrids of different species. Speaking of his choice to give his flying reptiles bat-like wings, he said, "I was once told by a 5-year-old that I knew nothing about pteranodons or pterodactyls, because they don't really have bat wings. Well, I know they don't. They should have had huge pieces of skin stretching from the top of their legs out beyond their claws. But what I had to think about was how these creatures of the air would work cinematically when I was animating them. So I used a certain amount of cinematic license and gave them what I saw as a more dramatic wings. In effect, we tried to find a compromise between strict scientific accuracy and that to need to achieve certain cinematic effects. And I believe we did the right thing. It gave them a fantasy element, and after all, we weren't making pictures for paleontologists." Harryhausen and Dalton, 2005, page 75. The famous and highly influential dinosaurs of the Jurassic Park series bear anatomies conflicting with fossil data, many of which were deliberately introduced to enhance attributes like size or visual impact. For example, the head of the Tyrannosaurus was made to look more ferocious with the addition of prominent vaulted ridges over the eyes, as well as larger, highly visible teeth. And feathers and filaments continued to be absent from the dinosaurs in this series. Save for a token effort in the third film, despite piles of dinosaur fossils accumulating over the last 2 decades which show these structures. This selective use of fossil data likely reflects the requirements of canon brand familiarity and the marketability of prehistoric animals as intimidating and awe-inspiring creatures, rather than actual animals adapted for mundane behaviors like keeping warm or hiding from predators. True paleoartists are less concerned with marketability or the creation of pleasing aesthetics. We have to follow scientific evidence to wherever it takes us, even if the resultant reconstruction is not what we expect or desire. This is a fundamental philosophical difference between the art produced by true paleoartists and those only concerned with making sellable merchandise. The third line between true paleoart and its merchandised equivalent is a point of frustration for many scientists, artists, and educators. There is nothing wrong with designing creatures strongly influenced by those that exist in deep time, nor is it a crime that paleontologically themed products are often designed for entertainment, not education. But an issue arises in that these selectively referenced, anatomically embellished creatures are often recognizable enough to their real-life counterparts that many laymen assume they are scientifically credible representations of fossil animals. The application of real scientific names to these creations, the promotion of these products alongside real facts about these animals, and even their endorsement by some paleontologists only blurs this line further. The effect of this is that merchandising grown from paleoart has much greater sway over public opinion than artworks produced with genuine scientific credibility. For educators and researchers hoping to promote new ideas about prehistoric life, this is a problem. The proliferation of outdated or flawed views of the past mean that the educational springboard offered by these products is offset against the need to deconstruct mistruths about ancient animal appearance and behavior. The obvious biases of paleoart. Potential topics of paleoart works is an enormous list. Literally hundreds of thousands of species are known to have existed on Earth before the modern day. But if the paleoart works accurately reflect the relative abundances of fossil types in the geological record, we would largely associate the discipline with images of marine invertebrates, mostly shellfish, certain arthropods, corals, and other colonial organisms and microscopic species. In actuality, most paleoart focuses on rarer, but more spectacular and exotic fossil species. Focus on, without doubt, non-avian dinosaurs are the commonest subjects of paleoart works, with predatory species being the most popular. Other groups of charismatic tetrapods, backboned animals with or ancestrally with 4 limbs, form the majority of other works, including the Mesozoic flying reptiles, pterosaurs, the marine reptiles, a variety of swimming lineages including ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and mosasaurs, and giant fossil mammals. Why does paleoartistic output ignore so many groups, including those which have much better fossil records than those of the likes of dinosaurs or mammals? There are likely several intertwined factors contributing to this. The first is a relatively problematic one. The availability of information. Animals, like dinosaurs, enjoy high levels of public exposure, and assessing the information required to restore them is comparatively easy. The same cannot be said for many other fossil groups, which can only be researched through relatively inaccessible and jargon-heavy technical literature. Moreover, the research focus of different paleontological fields emphasizes different aspects of their subject species, and many subsets of fossil sciences are simply not interested in reconstructing life appearance. It can be surprisingly difficult to know what the basic soft tissue anatomies of some fossil invertebrates look like, because their soft tissues are only given brief or highly diagrammatic coverage by scientists, these aspects being of less interest than their utility for dating rocks, determined paleoclimates, and so on. Researchers of some fossil vertebrates, like dinosaurs, however, tend to be much more interested in reconstructing life appearances and lifestyle and communicate these aspects more readily in their work. A second factor is restorability. Some animals, such as graptolites and Ediacaran biota, certain species from the Cambrian period, are essentially uninterpretable as living animals, as their soft tissues and relationships to living species remains mysterious. It's unsurprising that these species are largely ignored by artists because rendering them is more an exercise in speculation than science-led paleoartistry. We tend to favor species where we can create reasonable approximations of their ancient form. A third factor may be that some species are simply more charismatic than others. It's human nature to be impressed by attributes such as large size and exotic anatomy, and it is probably no coincidence that our favorite paleoart subjects tend to be those which demonstrate these attributes. Creatures such as the first snakes, frogs, or mammals, or extinct insects and clams are scientifically fascinating, but probably looked very similar to organisms around today. There's a relatively little need to restore them because their living relatives are close enough analogies to their appearance and behavior. This cannot be said for creatures like non-avian dinosaurs or pterosaurs, however, which present wholly extinct and now unrepresented body plans. But while we are drawn to unfamiliar subjects, we also tend to prefer those which are readily interpretable. Dinosaurs and other mainstays of paleoart are sufficiently different from modern animals to be interesting, but not so different that they defy easy understanding to non-experts. You don't need a PhD to appreciate Tyrannosaurus as a giant bulldozer of a predator, whereas Cambrian invertebrates, or unusual Triassic reptiles, confound even experts when it comes to life, appearance, and behavior. Perhaps this interpretive challenge is a barrier to paleoartists looking to create reliable takes on fossil species. Around these points, we might find an explanation for why paleoartistry is relatively biased towards certain species. Simply put, dinosaurs and other commonly depicted taxa present optimal attributes for paleoartists. They appeal to human curiosity with high-impact anatomy, are different enough to be interesting without being alienating, are known from sufficient fossil data detail to be restorable, and are studied by experts who are interested in topics relevant to life appearance. All this considered, it is unsurprising that a few animal groups dominate paleoart. There are conversations to be had about whether artists and outreach organizers would do well to feature lesser-known species from time to time, and certainly some artists do actively pursue artworks of animals lacking wider exposure. Why we need to care about paleoart. Paleoart is not just a hobby for paleontology enthusiasts or cultural outgrowth of research on fossil organisms. It is also an important element of paleontological science. It has a role and influence in paleontological science, has its own history, trends and fashions, and is especially important for communicating with the public. We might view the latter as its most important role. Studies of prehistoric life receive relatively high popular interest, and this places paleontology and paleoart on the front line of scientific outreach. The study and portrayal of fossil animals are the means through which many learn about the scientific process, the concept of deep time, the changing nature of the planet and biosphere, of evolution and natural selection, the history of our own species, and even our place in the wider universe. Well-produced paleoart allows us to make connections between the past and the modern age, as well as to visualize the natural and physical processes that have shaped the natural world. The fact that we can introduce these challenging concepts with charismatic fossil animals, exotic fieldwork locations, fascinating fossil specimens, and attention-grabbing artwork makes paleontology a terrific gateway science. An immediately interesting and exciting discipline that lays essential groundwork and pathways to other sciences. Given the impact, paleoart can have its own important role in outreach. Its practitioners have a responsibility to produce high-quality, scientifically sound artworks.